Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of my renewed podcast called Ireland Speaks. I'm recording here at my hidden location in a friend's farmhouse in an undisclosed place in this secret magical realm of a country that is known as Ireland or Éire. Tonight I have another very special guest. It is the niece of the great and growing in popularity, kind of legend really, John Moriarty, the philosopher and the thinker, the writer, the poet, the speaker. An extraordinary human being. For those who don't know him, you're in for a treat. For those who do know him, I think because of Amanda's connection with being his niece, and she really is one of the carriers of his flame in the depth of what she understands about his work. We're going to take a journey together, hopefully this evening. We both have our fires on and we're going to talk, discuss and expand and extol and feel into John's legacy, his work, Amanda's life, her connection with him, her relationship with him growing up, and the different values and philosophies and etymologies that John had so brilliantly uncovered on his journeying as he was called, the Bishop of the Margins. So welcome to a very special episode of Ireland Speaks on a burgeoning beautiful spring day. And I will just say hello to Amanda. How you doing?
Hi Alan, thank you for having me. It's good to hear by the fireside, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation about John and share the journey together. So looking forward to it. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, Amanda. I just want to start off and talk about, first of all, briefly about my own introduction to John. That was probably 15 years ago now, when I was in the Burren and I was wintering in the Burren, and someone had made a documentary which can give people more details about. And someone had given me all his audios on CD, actually. And I remember ultimately travelling all across Ireland back and forth with those CDs almost worn out. And I started passing them along to a couple of very well-known people there in the Burren. And I'd read some of his works. But it was the audios really that became integrated into my psyche in many ways. So that was my introduction. Many a winter lay by the fire with his voice travelling in the temple of the darkness of winter. So it really used to strike me and give me a lot of thought about my writing and my own discoveries. Now I've come into contact with you recently, and I want to hear more. Obviously, if no one knew anything about John Moriarty, I want you to begin and tell me more about who or what he is and what he represents and your connection with him.
Yes, I suppose my experience of John is different, and there is the labels. You know, he's an eco-philosopher, he's a poet, he's an author, he's a mystic. Moncon McGann has called him the bog shaman, and he has all those titles. But I was thinking my best way of describing John Moriarty is his story, because I think at the end of the day it is all about the story. And John Moriarty was a wild young Kerryman born in my van to Mary and Jimmy Moriarty. He was born into a small farm. His early education years weren't great. You know, he was not regarded as having intellectual abilities, really. He was earmarked to stay at home on the farm and work on the farm. And it was only by accident he continued his education into the college in Listowel, and he used to cycle in. My Auntie Madeline convinced him to go, and she did up an old rally bike in the shed, and so John ended up continuing his education. And it turned out that he was incredibly bright at school, especially when he discovered Greek and Latin. And you know, teachers are so important, because there was one teacher and one moment where he was recognised. You know, a question was asked to the class, and it was to translate, I think, a sentence in Greek. And John gave an attempt to translate it, assuming he was wrong. Everybody else in the class also assuming he was wrong. And it turned out he was right and everybody else was wrong. So that moment, that kind of singular moment, set him off on a new journey. And, you know, he did pursue education. He became a national school teacher. That wasn't exactly what he needed. More than that, he wanted to discover philosophy and logic, and he studied that in UCD. The story goes that he came out with a double first honours in philosophy and logic from UCD. And when the results arrived by post, he didn't even open them. He threw them up in the loft in the old farmhouse at home, and nobody really knew. And my grandmother then went into the stall sometime later, and people shook her hands at his achievement, and she had no idea because by this time, directly after that, John went to London and spent some time, I think maybe 11 weeks, homeless on the streets of London. It was luck that he met a woman that he had been in college with. She spotted him across the street and she took him to her place, and he cleaned up and he got a job, and then it went from there. He worked some time in England, then he became a professor of literature and history of European ideas in Manitoba. And he spent 9 years or so working there, and he was very successful in that. But John, as he describes it himself, he began to feel pot-bound. He began to feel suffocated within the system, within the structures. So even though he loved what he was doing, he felt he needed to get out of it, and he felt he was yearning for more. I suppose he had been exploring Native American Indian culture over there. He had been exploring Buddhism and Taoism and, the great world teachings. But he felt he needed to come back to Ireland. He needed to come back to his own roots in order to grow and outgrow, what he had become. So he returned to Ireland to find his bush soul. And that was, I suppose he thought it would be a fairly romantic journey, he'd be meditating and he'd be praying and discovering, it would be harmonious. But it turned out that there was a major crash, and John crashed in Connemara, and it was then the real journey began. So he found himself, as he said, it wasn't that he was Christian again, he was Christian for the first time. So he was discovering, I suppose, the religion that he had learned as a child and fallen out of as a child. He learned it anew from the perspective of the mystics. And he spent some time in a monastery then in Oxford. And, that was his saving grace, because at a time when John was going through the darkest night of the soul, and he was really fearing for his own sanity and fearing for what was happening to him, he found that the regularity and the rhythm of the monastic day, the silences and the steadiness, was healing for him. It was exactly what he needed. And he also found a great teacher there who was able to guide him, who understood what John was going through was not a breakdown, but it was a spiritual experience. And it took some time to integrate that. So the result is we have all these wonderful books and writings now, and John teaches with story. So I think that's why it's so important to tell John's story, because that's how he thought. That's the medicine he brings. And the reason he uses story is it's not a finished product. It's not like a dogma or a creed, or there's no certainty in it. It's fluid and it's continuing and evolving. And really, it's our job now to continue and evolve the legacy that John Moriarty has left us in those marvellous books and in those audio collections that you mentioned, Alan.
Very interesting, because I hear and feel the continuance of coming home. A lot of talk of the immigrant leaving the shoreline. I was talking to Cot about this in the other podcast, and John's journey, which I started, obviously at a deeper level than me, but just the general journey of being in Canada, in Manitoba, and then coming back to the bushland, the outland, but coming home to the home of Ireland, which structurally is I'm coming back to my family, I'm coming back to this. But then the other journey is you go out past the old past, and then you go into the other world of the real Ireland, which is the one you might have been slightly blind to growing up, and that revelation of seeing something new with new eyes. And I think his work is full of there's a clip actually I'm going to play, I think I can find it, where he talks about that, going out and not seeing trying not to see things as they normally are, but as they actually truly are. And I feel like what's extraordinary about him is he brought me personally deeply close into the unseen and made it very clear. So to bring that to people, it meant that you would have had to, like you said, he crashed a lot, I guess, and coming back to here now and the depth of Ireland is when I first heard of John Moriarty, I thought, like, who's this mad guy living out? The first the stereotypical image was of a person living out there almost bare and naked nearly in all ways, and just being out of the realms of the ordinary and the normal. And now, 15 years later, I see that has actually a place to always strive towards, rather than kind of looking at it in a funny way. And I'm curious, we'll play a clip in that in a few minutes, but I'm curious, he comes back home and he goes through the monastery, and he goes through the crash, and he goes through the dark night, and he goes through the unveiling of maybe his intellect meeting his spirit, and then that's where the real transformation happens. So going back to Kerry then is kind of, was that the next thing then, or was it Connemara?
I suppose he came back to Kerry. I think he'd outgrown Connemara probably by that stage. Connemara was marvellous to John, and it was where he did so much of his growing and so much of his writing, but he decided to come back down to Kerry. He always had this vision that he would set up a hedge school.
Right.
And that he would pass on his teachings in that way. So his vision was to be in Kerry. So he came back home to Kerry, I suppose only for the last 11 or 12 years of his life, but much of his growing happened in Connemara.
Now tell people who don't know the idea of what a hedge school is, just for people who are listening who might not understand what that means.
So I suppose, we see school and we talk about education and we talk about the education system and we talk about religion and we talk about, religious institutions. But the idea of a hedge school is that it exists outside of these institutions and outside of these conformities. So it's like a school in the wild, a school in nature where, you're not restricted, I suppose, by the same... not fenced in the same way as the education. So there's more freedom in it. There's more freedom to teach kind of naturally or differently, and there's more room for expression. I think one of the things I came across today when I was listening to something in the car is, like, John says poets must be healers, so not just poets, but artists and musicians and people who are connected with the imaginal part. So I suppose that is kind of suffocated in the school system to a large degree, whereas in the hedge school system, I think John would be tipping far more into that kind of teaching and expression from that level, which is possibly a little bit, it's below intellect in some way, but I don't mean below intellect as in it's lesser than intellect. In fact, it probably is the source of intellect. But John questions our rational way of seeing things, our scientific way of seeing things. He says, he's not saying there's anything wrong with it, but he's saying, science shouldn't have the microphone to itself.
Yeah,
there needs to be the story, there needs to be the poetry, there needs to be the imaginal, the dramatic. So he talks about bringing us down into the folklore element of our mind and to the earthed element. So it would be coming from that level. That's where John, as a great educator himself, that's where he was hoping to educate from.
I'm going to play that clip actually that refers to the folkloric tradition and descending into the senses and the story that's always available here in our tradition. So bear with me for a second there. I'll just pull that clip up.
I mean, the house goddess, I think we have slightly a too refined version of what the Celtic thing might have been sometimes, and any religion that can't admit the terrible is probably not worth our consideration. If it's all too lovely and all too nice, then I don't think it wouldn't be helping the likes of me anyway, with the difficulties that I find in my nature. Do you know what I mean? But I was wondering, maybe, would we start with a couple of stories that I would just tell to get us to come into the folklore part of our minds, just to get out of the kind of prime time things, to get out of what television would have done to our minds and radio might have done to our minds, and come back into maybe the genius that is in our minds. And folklore is always a wonderful place of revelation, and I think science will eventually, modern science, its physics and its chemistry and its biologies, it will eventually have to come home to folklore, because folklore is, I think, a place of wonderful and great revelation about who we are and the kind of world we live in. And J.B.S. Haldane has said that he was a great Cambridge scientist, and he said, "It is my suspicion that the universe isn't only queerer than we suppose, it is queerer than we can suppose." And by queer, he meant, he was using the word queer now in its wonderful, great medieval sense, Elizabethan sense of being beyond any set of categories with which we would seek to understand it, whether those categories be religious or philosophical or scientific, whatever. Throw whatever net you wish into the world of nature and bring out what you wish, what will come in the net, and you still won't have got near nature or near the universe. So that sense of queer as beyond any human understanding. And it is a pity, like when our eyes turn into economic brain tumours and we see a cow coming down the road, we can only see kilos of meat, and we see a tree and we can only see cubic feet of timber or planks of timber, and we look up into the night sky and we see God's handiwork, something's made like a table, a chair. I mean, we have it in the Nicene Creed that we say in Mass, God is factorum caeli, God is a maker, and you've some sense that a tree wasn't made or the galaxy wasn't made. So just a sense, would we spend a while with a couple of stories that'll maybe ease us into the strange.
That was a clip there, one of the first clips. We were playing a few of them with John meditating on the folklore tradition and the idea of, as Joseph Campbell said, that we are the torchbearers of the universe, the artists. And what's beautiful about that is he's just simply saying, I mean, you look at now, the times we're living in right now, that folklore has become more essential than ever to take us out of the phone and the addiction and the potency of the amount of false information being fed to us on a second-to-second basis, which outdoes the television and radio by far. So more than ever now, what he's saying is really relevant about folklore and story, and rethreading that back into our lives. And as the saying goes, there's more in heaven and earth than you can dream of, So tell me more, Amanda, about what you feel about what he said there in the folklore tradition and how it was binded to his psyche and his emotional philosophy.
Well, Alan, isn't it wonderful to, hear John Moriarty in his element, and you can hear the passion in his voice, and you can hear how enthused he is about what he is trying to teach. And he's saying, folklore and nature is a place of revelation. And I think when we come down to that level, we become maybe childlike again. We have access to that wonder child part of ourselves, rather than the intellectual. I think the modern world, you were talking there about I suppose technologies and things like that, but the modern world is all about inputting information, isn't it?
Yeah.
Inputting facts and filling ourselves with facts, and gaining accolades because we can repeat those facts. And I think John is trying to say that, and I think it's my own experience, that there's nothing like direct experience. Those facts are limiting. In fact, one of the stories he tells in those audio clips is about little Amanda and the cow calving. And, little Amanda's watching a cow calving with John in the cow stall in my van. and there's a waiting going on, and they're chatting together, and then the little front hooves of the calf appear from the back of the cow, and the little Amanda's 4, and she says, that's wrong. And John is fascinated that she knows that this is the wrong way for something to be born. So he discovers that little Amanda knows that her head came first. And he starts to, if you remember, he starts to slowly question her and say, where did you come from, Amanda? And she's able to say, well, I came from my mommy's tummy. And then he goes on further and he says, where did your mommy come from? And Amanda's able to say, she came from Granny's tummy. And then when he asks her finally, where did Granny come from? There was nobody beyond Granny in Amanda's experience in the world. So she had no clue. She had no idea where Granny had come from. And, he uses that story to explain that our knowledge is limited. We think knowledge is, it is power in a certain way, but there's maybe as much value in not knowing and in retaining the beginner's mind, because once we have that, then, we're in a place where we're able to continue to grow and outgrow, as John says, to learn and relearn. And how many times in your life or my life have we had to relearn what we thought we knew, through experience or through different things that have happened?
Well, isn't it that I probably will paraphrase this wrongly, but it is from the Bible, I think, where we've talked about this before, the way, and it's basically, it's not to strive in this world. It's, the world is already perfected. It's for us to beholden the world, to see it in all its glory, and I think the world is obviously, I think when we were talking about the busyness, I thought about the N50 in Dublin, and then I thought about a butterfly, and there's the two contrasting parallels, which is the perfection of a butterfly and the madness of a road built that goes nowhere, with everyone chasing each other's tails, bumper to bumper. And to come down into, like you said, the not knowing, the mystery, the born again, the beginning again. As I say, when a child is born, the world begins again. And to look into an animal's eyes or a child's eyes, and even what you said about Amanda saying, no, she knew a certain amount, but then she didn't know as well intuitively, as you said. So I found that very interesting, where you said that she knew what was right and what was wrong biologically, has an instinct, has an intuitive. And I remember one time you reading one of his books about or it was one of his audios talking about the colt being nervous because that was it jumped, I think, because that was a nervous system from 1 million years ago or something, that the animal. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you know that?
I do. That's the story of the Vermont colt, and he tells it in, I think he tells it in Nostos, and he probably tells it in Turtle Was Gone a Long Time as well. It's the story of a colt born in Vermont, where obviously it had no knowledge or experience of buffalo. And scientists did an experiment where they shook the robe of a buffalo, the skin of a buffalo, behind this colt, and it was terrified. It was visually terrified. So it begs the question, where did this terror come from in a colt that had no direct experience of buffalo? So what John is saying is that, there are latent terrors, latent fears, also latent genius and latent wisdom in the human psyche. And the way in is not through uploading more information. The way to access that, perhaps, is through imagination, through direct contact, and through maybe harrowing experiences at times, Alan.
I'm just, this stuff is coming into my mind because it's all just coming back a little bit. Another story where he said, in terms of learning from nature, where he went and he lay down where the hare had laid, and he stayed there for a long time. The warmth of the grass from the hares where it had been sleeping had left that place, and he lay down on it. And I get that sometimes. I'm on my friend's farm a lot, and where his cats have different comfy spots, and they'll have a little bale of hay or some wood shavings, and I'll go up and find them, but I'll know they've just left a while ago because the place is still warm. And I think even the manger in the Christ mythos of being born in the manger, which is around the innocence of animals, that warmth, doesn't that, even if you're not religious, doesn't that feel ultimately comforting to us? It's like there's a mystery around that mythology, and there's also a mystery around animals and what their innocence gives to us. So do you think folkloric tradition, through his eyes, has a root? Like you said, does the cult have a root of its story? You know what I mean? Is that what he's trying to say?
Well, I suppose he does say that if we're in touch with animal nature within ourselves, we will find that we will be in touch with animal nature outside of ourselves. And he does tell a lovely story about little Sarah, his neighbour in Connemara. She was very young and she was out in the yard playing, and she had, I think, only a single red shoe on. And the mare and her foal were eating out of a bucket in the yard. And, she was unafraid. She walked directly over and she made contact with the mare, and she was tiny. So I suppose a lot of our fears are conditioned. They come from, I think when I was young, I was a very fearless person. I had very few fears, but you acquire them. We're constantly saying, don't do that, be afraid. The media even nowadays is constantly telling us, be afraid, but in our natural state, there's not a lot. We aren't born fearful for the most part, I think.
Now, we're sort of keeping on this sort of, say, the bio timeline of his life. So he comes back now. He spent a period of time gardening in Connemara, remember that? And
yeah.
But he was then starting to write his first book, or there was all these notes, thoughts and ideas because of his time in nature was starting to accumulate into actual produced work, or what was the timeline of that?
I think John started off in Canada and he was writing mostly poetry. In his early writing, it was mostly poetry he was writing. And it was in Connemara that I think he started writing 6 stories. He started telling 6 stories. He used to go from place to place telling these stories. So I think 6 stories was among his earliest writings, and he says he had started it in Canada, but obviously it evolved in Connemara because of some of the characters that are in it. Martin McCahill, his friend, and all those people featured in it. So obviously it evolved, and he gave it names and he gave it characters and he gave it form in Connemara. So, these are wonderful stories. And the interesting thing about 6 stories is he calls them 6 initiations, 6 rites of passage. So, they meet the reader at their own level, I feel. So you can read them and be entertained by them, because John was very, very funny. He was an excellent storyteller. He was enthralling to listen to. But then you can listen to them again a second time or a third time, like you driving around Ireland in your car and with the CDs on, and then you I don't know if you've experienced this, but my God, you'll discover something that you completely missed the first time around because you're listening from a different place or a different level,
life.
Yeah.
It's like, I haven't gone back to listen to them in quite a long time, I'll be honest with you. And there's many reasons why, but probably because I've been on my own journey for a long time in the landscape here. But I do know there'll be times where I know almost every syllable of every part of those CDs. And depending on my mood, my mode, my inner narrative, whether I was going through calamity, which a lot happened then after that, I couldn't go back to something because it was too painful. Because in a way he was preaching future prophecy of what I'd yet to experience, and he had the medicine there ahead of time. And it was just, now if I went back, I'd be really interested to see what nuances or what would he speak to me in a more personal way, in a way, because I always felt like I was sort of observing him. Now I'd be sort of living closer to how his nature is, and I'm wondering, that's what's very depthful about what he has. Is that I always loved his voice because it was like a travelling church for me. I drove to many different, all over Ireland many times, and he'd be playing while I'd be driving to the snow, or I'd sometimes open the car door standing on a mountain and kind of get his song like a spell, casting something into the land. And, our tradition is oratory primarily, I think, a lot of the stories. So, and the voice to me, it reaches me very quickly. So I'm thinking of all the listeners out there about how powerful voice is in the world, how they misuse voice in the mainstream narrative. But when his voice, which is so distilled by so much time in silence, which is really fascinating to me actually, is that John would have spent a lot of time in contemplation, and then he comes out and it was almost like in a rush, like a dam bursting. I remember a little story I'll tell you, that a good friend of mine, a priest in Liscannor, Dennis Crosby, who's friends with John O'Donoghue, who probably most people would know the name of, and John Moriarty. And he drove with John O'Donoghue out to a party in Connemara, and they all knew John O'Donoghue, and he was talking and telling them about Celtic. And again, this is not a spiritual in either of them, because he was a very deep individual as well. But he had never met John, I don't think, at that point. And John O'Donoghue would stop speaking, and John Moriarty said, "Do you mind if I say a few things?" And then Dennis said that John talked for 8 hours straight after that.
I believe it. Brendan Flynn from Clifton used to drive John to some of the talks that he gave, maybe in University College Galway, but he was doing a talk on the wasteland, by T.S. Eliot, and it was scheduled for 2 hours, and I think 4.5 hours later he was still talking, and nobody had left. Nobody had left. Nobody wanted him. Absolutely enraptured, and the conversation continued. So, yeah, I believe you. It's interesting, I think, Alan, that you say that, when you were going through your own darkness or your own particular journey, that you didn't listen to John. But what I think is, I have, of my own experience of darkness and hard times as well in my own life. And I'm very glad that I had done some reading and done some listening, and I had been exposed to the depths of John Moriarty's teaching before my own journey started, because it certainly helped. It's something you could fall back on.
Oh, absolutely.
It's something.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm saying I'm just from a particular without getting too personal. I found it too painful because it was a very particular part of my life with a relationship, and it had ended, and it was hard for me to go back, because it kept reminding me of a whole period of my life. Now it's different now. I find actually, just even listening to some of the clips today, I'm drawn towards it again, because I've changed again, completely unaltered. But his stuff is sort of oddly eternal in a way, and because there's so much condensed, like I said, like this rush of this multiplicities of story, information, personal experience. And what I loved about John was the interweaving of the micro and the macro. It was the tiniest detail of, like you said, I remember that story of his neighbour's daughter stepping through the legs of the horse, and how terrified he was that the horse was going to kick. And of course, because she was without fear, and she penetrated that wall of the horse's senses, they were both, like the lion laying down with the lamb, they were both already home in each other's senses, whereas we have to go through a big journey to become less afraid of the other, of nature, and
I suppose in that clip earlier, we were talking about animals, and John is talking about, when we look at a cow and we see only kilos of meat or litres of milk, and more and more there is the commodification of resources, of natural of nature. And he does say that the animals retreat from us, because it's not only us that have become fearful as adults, but the animals have also become fearful of us. So the gap has somehow maybe become wider. Let's say, for example, modern farming practices, cows are never handled anymore, not in the way that they would have been in the farm in North Kerry where John grew up, where Jimmy Moriarty was bringing their hay every night and talking to them and sitting down having a cigarette in their company, so they had no fear of him and he had no fear of them. But it's different now because, modern farmer practices are so intensive.
Yeah,
So
and
there's
bureaucratic.
very,
Yeah,
so it's different. So we need to get back to that kind of connection. And one of John's greatest teachings, as far as I am concerned, is the teaching that we need to bring down those boundaries that exist, not just between human beings of different persuasions and different political ideologies or religious beliefs, but between humans and animals, between
absolutely. Yeah.
humans and the natural world. So that's one of his most important kind of teachings. And he does say that, nature has recoiled from us in a way.
But
It no
yet,
longer, yeah,
but yet, I always believe nature's always inviting as well. Like two little stories
yeah,
related to where I am right now. I'm helping a friend here restore his farmhouse, and he was out this morning. So he has two bulls from his other friend John, who's a lovely man, and I had to go up and feed the bulls. It was a beautiful spring morning, and these three goats, these three goats up there, I'll tell you. So I carry the food up to the goats, and I know the goats well. Two little bucks and the mother, who's got a bit of a sore leg. So she's kneeling down, and I bring up the food there, and I have, they come and they try and butt you and stuff, but I wasn't really watching, and I was half awake, and I got butted in the back, and the food, the two of them had a go at me, and I was laughing, and the bulls were watching me getting butted, and the bulls are just sitting there snorting behind the cage, and I had to go and feed them silage, and I got up, and the mother they all took the food, everything was grand. I climb in there, and I'm feeding the bulls then, and the bulls are. I feel so comfortable. Like, of course, they're behind a protection thing there, but the innocence of them. I can feel the innocence of them. I mean, they're not to be trifled with, but I wasn't looking at them like, God, there's a fight. There's economy in them. I just looked at them with their need. They're waiting for someone to come and allow them to get nourishment. Same with the goats, who are more playful, obviously. But and then I was coming back down the hill. The dog was running after me. And it was just a glorious moment of silence and in tribute to the animal kingdom. I came back down then, and I seen a yellow finch land on a tree, and it was like busy and looking alert and had a mission in its eyes. Like, I suddenly felt like, spring is here. So that run of that connection woke me up. That was my waking. That was my alarm call from just after waking up, was all those little funny incidents, So I think nature, as much as it recalls, also nature's also constantly inviting us, but we have to meet it with reverence, I think, which John did, obviously.
yeah. I think Martin Shaw picks up on that, in his book, A Hut at the Edge of the Village, which he wrote about John. He says that, we need to move from seeing to beholding, from understanding to beholding. So that word behold,
I love that word.
To behold nature and to behold maybe animal nature or
because it's already perfected.
Other beings, really.
It's already perfected. It's perfect. It's just that what did they say? And again, you don't have to be religious if you'll understand. You could call it Gaia or Buddha or the divine.
Yeah.
I say all glory is God's, or Gaia is all glory is Gaia's. The rest is man's mistakes. Our M50 lives and our rushing and this unconscious intensity compared to the butterfly or the finch landing on the tree. There's a certain tragedy to me about how much time is given increasingly to unnecessary tasks when we should be allowed to behold it. And that's why we're all so tired. We're being forced to rush, and it's not in our natural spirit,
Did you hear that story? He or maybe it was read. He talks about the Trans-Canada Highway. You're talking about the M50. He was talking about the Trans-Canada Highway. It goes from one end of the country to the other.
Wow, yeah.
Without stopping, and it pushes its way through mountains. It doesn't go around anything. It's a direct line. It's a straight line. And he compares that to Rafferty's Ireland. Where you're going around windy bends and roads, and you're stopping off at every gate to have a chat with a neighbour or a friend and find out what's happening, or you're sitting in the woods along the way. So I suppose they're two very different ways of experiencing the world. And this John, in his writing, even, he wasn't linear. He says that he resisted linearity. His writing was never going to be like a thesis or, going from A to B with a series of steps. That's not the way John wrote. He wrote like a tapestry, or he wrote like a piece of music or a piece of poetry. So, that linear kind of thing that we are conditioned into, you must do this, and this, and then you've got it made. He kind of resisted that, or being fenced into that.
We're going to play another clip now, which follows on from that, which is the story of talking about the African tribesmen carrying the luggage for the
Oh yes,
explorer.
Waiting for our souls.
And we'll talk about that after this clip.
Wonderful African ivories and splendid carvings. Now, he was somewhere in the heart of Africa, and he had to get them to the coast of the Indian Ocean to rendezvous with a ship that would be passing that way full of the third next moon. And so he hired the best African porters he could get, not just strong men, but he had to hire men who were happy, because this was going to be a long journey. And one morning, having eaten, they were ready to assume their burdens, and off they went, singing their songs. And it was a joy to be with them, because they were happy, and the spirits of their ancestors were coming with them, and their gods were coming with them. And the next morning again, they assumed their burdens, and off they went. And the third morning, and the fourth morning, and the fifth morning, these people were happy people. And they travelled finally out of their own tribal lands into other kinds of lands that were geologically different, and the vegetation was different, and the animals were different. But they were still singing, and their gods were coming with them, because the gods were in the songs. And after 2.5 moons, it looked as if they had made tremendous progress. They had indeed made tremendous progress, and they were going to be at the coast of the Indian Ocean to rendezvous with the ship. But then one morning, having eaten, they didn't happily assume their burdens. Instead, they seemed to sink into some tremendous trance state within themselves. And this old plunder explorer began to be very upset and to get belligerent, and finally he took out a revolver and fired shots over them, but he was making no impression whatever on them, because these people had sunk into some kind of trance state. Anyway, after a while he wised up, and he sat down beside one of them, and he said, "What's going on? During the last 2.5 months, we've made tremendous progress. Now what's happening?" And it took a long, long time for this man, this black man, to come out, this African, to come out of his trance state, to come into a sense of his own hands and his own feet, and a sense of his own identity as a person. But finally he did emerge into the sense of who he was, and he turned to him and he says, "I will tell you. We have moved so far, so fast during the last 2.5 moons that we must now sit down and wait till our souls catch up." Now, it seems to me that during the last 3 centuries in Europe, we have moved so far, so fast, that we really have lost our souls. And losing our souls is, according to the first peoples of the world in the 19th century, if I was a 19th century anthropologist, I would call them the primitive peoples of the world, wouldn't I? I would use the word primitive, meaning that I was somehow superior and advanced. But let's call them the first peoples of the world. To lose your soul is the great calamity. Only the greatest of medicine men, only the greatest of shamans can handle that, can bring you back to be in touch with your soul again. We have lost our soul, and because we have lost our soul, we aren't able to see soul in anything else. And we have now arrived at a point like where the utilitarian thing, John Mill's utilitarian thing, but a universal utilitarian attitude to thing, use and benefit. That use and benefit attitude and has so taken over that right now our eyes are like brain tumours. Our eyes in the West are almost like brain tumours. Brain tumours of economic seeing. I mean, all you have to do is listen to the radio or listen to farmers talking down in Connemara, where I come from, and they will see a cow coming down the road, and that cow is just kilos of meat. They can't see a living being with soul. They see kilos of meat. I remember once in Ballyhinch, walking up by a wonderful salmon river, glorious, you're being mirrored, and the salmon and the sea trout are running, and if you were there in the morning, you'd have seen the otters. And it's between 2 lakes, the stretch of the river, and it gives you your soul. And if you were to say, "I don't have soul," you could imagine the river saying, "Well, that's all right, I'll be soul to you," because the river seems to be liquid soul, just all soul.
So that was very interesting. I think both of us have heard this story before, obviously, many times, about them waiting for their souls to catch up. What do you feel what he's saying there, and what it represents, particularly now in this world what we were just talking about soul loss, and everything racing too quickly, you know.
Yeah, John would say lost soul is the great calamity of our age. He writes that in Turtle Volume 1. But I think it's so true, to be honest. I mean, we're so busy, we're so distracted in our lives, and that it's become normal. And we are so frightened, like we mentioned earlier, that we've become disconnected. You know, the relatedness, even in our communications and things like that, the way that people used to relate one time, well, I suppose was more intimate. There was more dependency. There was more need in it. Whereas now, you know, it can be a text or it can be something that is really not connecting very well. So, like, soul has hugely to do with connection. And if you go back to the story, like, those Bushmen were aware that they had lost connection with soul, but we haven't even an awareness of it unless something happens and trips us up in our lives. Or and where did that happen, and how did that happen? And John would say it happened 4 centuries ago, you know, in the age of reason, when we started to become more reliant on intellect and on reason for our knowing. And then of course we had the Industrial Revolution, and then we had, you know, Europe and the world wars and things like that. So, you know, all of that has contributed to our sense of disconnect from the deeper layers that we talked about earlier, which are soul, imagination, earth,
And we don't
divine
use the
ground.
word. We use phones to communicate to the
Yeah.
gate of, but we don't use the words communion. You don't say, I'm going to get on the phone and commune. Whereas when I love that word communing. It has a more warmer feel about, you know, coming into connection with, like, something bigger or something deeper. And I think the human voice is a place of communion. And that's why primarily I'd say we've lost a lot of that, because we're texting most of our conversations more than talking on the phone. Even talking on the phone is not as much as a crime as texting on the phone, because we're hearing the soul voice, the voice of the human being, talking back to us and listening to us. So we don't know how well we're being listened to when we type something. So we don't commune text, but we commune with each other's voices.
Well, it's a way not to communicate. If
Yeah.
a way not to be in communion with, or to be
Yeah.
in relatedness with, in one way, like, you know, it provides a barrier. But like, if you listen to, John tells another story about a Kalahari bushman, and, you know, he an explorer went to the Kalahari, I suppose, and the bushman sat listening to the stars, and he could not understand how the Western explorer wasn't able to hear the stars. So, you know, that to imagine that that is even possible, we are so far removed from that. And I think that is a huge loss. Like, relatedness is in a way the antidote to what is happening in the modern world. I think, you know, and John, on his headstone in Killarney, you know, he's buried in Ahado Cemetery in Killarney, and his epitaph is Mitikuya Ayasin, and these are Lakota words, and they mean we are all related, we are all kin. And I think John's entire philosophy, if you could put it into one sentence, that would be it. You know, that sense of relatedness with everything that is, and to the ground that we emerge from, and to the divine ground as well. So he's saying that that genius is within us,
Yeah.
and the obstacles are also within us, if you like.
But you, several times I've talked to different people, and they said the same thing about loss. I think it's a temporary loss, like a temporary loss of memory, or a trauma. It's a trauma rather than a permanent loss. And I think you can find your way back through his writings, through your experience in nature, through the finch singing on the tree. It can only be that revelation of coming back into the eternal, that community, is only a heartbeat, a breath away. A breath away, and it can happen to any of us at any time. It could be. I remember once traveling to Galway, and it was a winter's morning, and it was going to some little job I was doing from the Burren to Galway. And Galway City's not a difficult, easy place to drive into in the mornings. It's like New York almost. And I remember the winter sun was very strong and luminescent, and I looked across the way and I seen literally this image of about 40 deer just stopping and staring at the cars rushing by, and behind them was a stag. So I got out of my car and I stopped, pulled over. All the other cars were speeding by in the early morning rush, and it was like God had poured them from his hands onto the earth, and it was just a shimmering apparition of absolute perfection and beauty. And I just couldn't understand why nobody else was looking at this. They were all observing us, which is, nature is observing us. And it was just this miracle of this vision. Yeah. It just presented itself there without words, but in pure communion. And it only took a heartbeat of a glance for me to enter into that place, to enter into completely losing man's troublesome world and coming into that invitation. And I believe it's a re-remembering. It's not a loss. It's just a matter of a re-remembering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with you on that. It's available to all of us at all times, and we probably all get glimpses of it, just like you say there. You know what I mean? You pass something or you see something, and wow, you're stopped in your tracks, and you're present to whatever that miracle is, that ordinary miracle. We're not talking about extraordinary. We're talking about things that are there in front of us, whether it's a river or a bird or a child, a beautiful child. John would say that there are veils. So I suppose that two things came to mind when you were speaking there. There are what he calls veils. So they're veils that they protect us from this kind of seeing all the time. And maybe there's reason for these veils, is what he say, because too sudden an exposure, too sudden a realization might be overwhelming for us. We might not be able for that anymore. And that's part of what he's saying. But he tells us that there's practices. And one of the things he says we can practice is silver branch perception. So we can be open to seeing things in their silver branch wonder. So maybe one of the ways I find I like doing this, and one of the uses of the phone, is I love spotting these wonderful things to take photos of when I'm out on the beach or out in nature. Mm-hmm. And like it's like looking out for these miracles. It's like becoming aware of them and seeing the beauty where you might not otherwise see it.
It's a practice, really, isn't it? It's actually, I was just thinking when you were saying that, it's a muscle. It's a muscle you have to work on. I mean, I've taken hundreds of thousands of photographs and probably channeled poetry in every conceivable direction. From only ever, my journey into nature is as much as the same as going to the shops. I don't mean that in a banal way. I mean, I could not be making some kind of journey every day toward Skye. It's completely normalized in my behavioral routines. And there's a lot of people who don't even make that exercise in themselves to go away from what is the known in their normal routine and just stand there. And what's that? What did Kafka say? One doesn't even have to leave the room. One only has to sit in a chair and the world will unroll in ecstasy at your feet. That's what he's saying, that the ecstasy is right there. It's right in front of your hand. It's right in front of your eyes. And
yes. I'm thinking there, Sir Alan Moore, he's an English author, I think. And I was listening to him talking about place and writing. Mm. And, we're talking about poets must be healers, and you're obviously a poet. Yeah. And he's saying, about the connection, writing can be a revelation about a place. So by writing about it or by speaking about it, you can give a glory and an honor to that place, maybe that somebody else doesn't see. And that is a way of practicing or revealing silver branch perception to another person. I remember being in John's company one day in Killarney, and this was a time of my life in my 20s where moss was something to be eradicated, something to be sprayed and scraped off and got rid of. In my new house that was going to be perfect, and I went back to John, and there was a standing stone outside of his front door, and you might have seen it in some of the pictures of John, but we came through the front door. My son was a little boy, and John, caught sight of the moss growing up along this stone, and he was just arrested. He was just taken aback, and he said, "My God, will you look at that?" And he went over and he touched it, and he said, "Look at the color of that." And I was, whatever happened in that moment, it was a very simple thing, but it was like he was able to transfer his perception of that moss as a wonder and as something marvelous to me in his words. And I never again looked at moss in the same way. And then it's not just moss. You look at things that we consider to be weeds, like daisies or dandelions or these beautiful flowers, but we're trained and we're conditioned to believe that, they must be eradicated because they're weeds. And you look at the world differently. So when somebody, whether it's a writer, or
singer,
even a photograph, or somebody reveals something beautiful about something ordinary, that is how Silver Branch perception is taught, I suppose, or is shown.
And Ireland is filled from heel to foot with that. It's I was saying on the last podcast, I actually believe there's no veil. It's just an altering our perception. And I remember John talking about walking into fields of memories. I've talked about last week about Valentia Island, and there's so much memory for me there that I don't know. I'm like the young girl. I don't know why I know there's a memory that I'm familiar with, but yet it's completely mysterious to me. And there's a lot of places in Ireland that are filled with a familiarity, yet remain completely unknowable. And that's the most beautiful experience, is to be in a place of utter familiarity, but yet know nothing about the place. That's the purest way to find a place, I think. The first time you see it, it has a sense of familiarity, yet total mystery. That's a lovely place to be in. And
it
Ireland,
is, and
sorry.
And that brings us to consider, Alan, I think, who are our teachers? Who are the great teachers that can teach us this? And like John would say, some of his own greatest teachers were his father, who was, uneducated because he was orphaned as a young boy in Dingle, and he didn't get the opportunity to be educated. And John considers him one of his greatest teachers. And Martin McCall in Connemara, an old person who never was a bachelor, who never left Connemara, but he was wonderfully connected to the story and the ideas of the Sidhe and the fairies and the land, and he reintroduced John to Dreamtime Connemara, if you like. And if I'm to look at my greatest teachers, they're not the professors, they're not the
they're
the academics.
Yeah. Can I actually?
My greatest. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I suppose one of my greatest teachers has turned out to be my daughter Anna. She's nonverbal. She has labels such as autism, intellectual disability, ADHD. But my God, could you learn something from her? You know what I mean? She's connected in a different way because maybe of these things, and I don't see her as that at all. She's just a wonderful person who connects differently, and there's an egolessness in it that we can learn so much from. I think that's the thing. How do we learn? How do we relearn our way in the world so that we can do better than we have been doing?
I guess I'm going to read a poem here, not because I want to read loads of poetry here, but you were talking about people who inspired, and you had John, to me, was like, that disembodied voice that traveled with me. And there was another man I'd met who, like you, when I had thought I had somewhat of an education, I moved away back from America to the Burn, and in an old land commission college beside a house I was renting, there was a man called Patrick O'Leary, and he had rags on his back and 6 cows, but my God, his eyes were luminescent. Do you mind if I read this little poem in tribute to
I'd
him?
love it.
And it's called The Farmer's Hands, and I think it sort of might surmise what we were talking about the education of the simplicity of a certain way of living. It's called The Farmer's Hands, ode to Patrick O'Leary, wherever you are. He's gone now. Winter bore a man of earth, a burren lonely man, his olded eyes and sun-creased face, staring from his cottage in a dark and lonely place. He died before I knew him well, cows circled his broken home, taking vows of silence as the rain poured in. He was a ghost who walked alone. He had hands of rock, yet he moved like the wind as a sovereign silent clock. He would task his animals with gentle care, and I would see him through the windows, a ragged ghost of the holy air. And whilst others lined the concrete roads, filled with worries and heart-filled loads, Patrick would ponder the depth of a lake, or the size of a whiskey for his guest to take. For generations from his clan stared into those flames of a fire that burned that had no name, his wrinkled hands, his Guinness lips, his devil smile always drinking in sips. For this limestone wasteland was his place, and his sauntering feet never left a trace. His words, they felt like an ancient song, passed on the mouths from his blood long gone. He was an epic man who outran his fate, and his funeral was spoken by a bird on a gate. Yet the finches knew on the wings of time that Patrick flew on the rhythm of a rhyme, for the poem of Ireland kept his belly full, the rich broken landscape or the meat of a bull. And at night small universes spoke his name, and his cottage was moonlit in homage to a man who remained untamed. So if he drove in the night, you could see his shape wandering the roads like a ghost trying to escape. But now he's left, he's gone toward that distant sun, and the bachelor king leaves behind no one. So when you visit the burn, look for this empty dirt road near a magnificent dolmen beside a broken abode. Call out the name Patrick O'Leary in the night, and you might just see his laughing shadow light. For the men of the West, the old farmers one and all, carry the soul of Ireland and will never, ever fall.
Wow. It's just beautiful. Yeah, and the people that we kind of not disregarded, but that have been passed by the modern world in some ways, and they have all these wonderful connections. And if I look at my grandfather, John's father, Jimmy Moriarty, and I'm reminded a lot listening to that about him, because he wasn't a good farmer because he just cared too much about his animals, and he wasn't thinking in terms of economics. But his ability to grieve and his ability to be in communion with, we're talking about that, and to be ordinary was his great teaching. That was his great teaching.
Well, that story which haunts me, but it's one of the most powerful places on his audios, was John. I mean, it was incredible storytelling, where John went to the whole story of his mother passing, then his father, just incredible, praying for the safe travel of his mother to the other side. And I think he repeated a prayer for days on end. And then his passing, that whole, I don't know, where's that from, by the way, Amanda? What part is that
That's on a Radio Kerry podcast. It's Maurice O'Sullivan who did the interview for Radio Kerry, and it's available. If you Google Maurice O'Sullivan, John Moriarty, Radio Kerry, you'll get it as a podcast. It is a powerful. I suppose I dread to even attempt to tell it, because there's such emotion, and there's such power in John, vulnerability in John's voice. He's telling that. And the prayer my grandfather was, he says it was like a ship in the night, sailing them out, or attempting to sail out into eternity. For my grandmother Mary, who had died, she died suddenly, and it was, may Jesus who died on the cross have no hard feelings against you, Mary. May Jesus, who died on the cross, have no hard feelings against you, Mary. And that went on and on like a mantra. And he, and he had that sense of being able to cross, and to be able to cross with prayer and with pure grief, like the way my grandfather was able to grieve. it still strikes me. I remember as a child him grieving. I remember him stroking her feet when she was laid out in the bed, keeping them warm, and the crying. Like, he had that ability to just grieve and be as he was. And, having experienced grief myself, and I can only take it in small doses, And I think of my grandfather, who fully exposed himself to that and came through, And John telling that is one of the most powerful things you're likely to listen to.
That I recommend. I'll try and put up those links at the end of the credits here, because because it's late here now, I'm thinking of those. I don't mean darkness, but I've had a lot of grief in my life in different forms. I've tried to translate it as much as I can to stop myself from drowning in it. And when my own mother, because I'm thinking of what his father, when my own mother was passing, was in the hospice, and I was living in the west of Ireland, she was in Dublin, and my family were in Dublin, but I had to come back around Christmas, or before Christmas, when she was really weak, and basically say goodbye to her. Now, she was semi-conscious, so she didn't know I was there, but I had to come in and out about 8 or 9 times to actually have a final image of her to carry with me into eternity. It was and that's what that story provoked that in me. We just said that. I drove, after saying goodbye about 10 times, as in going in and out of the hospice, and kept saying goodbye and coming back in again, because your birth mother you're never going to see her again. I then drove the most loneliest stretch of time in my life, where I drove back across the west of Ireland to a little village in Kilfenora with the image of her cupped in my heart across this lonely landscape of neon lit Dublin traffic, then eventually going into the darker realms where the street lights would be gone and you'd be on the motorway. And it was just that repetition in my head of carrying an as yet unbloomed grief. Like, it was like carrying something that hadn't bloomed yet, because it was only new, and then eventually she did pass a couple of days later, and then it all exploded out. But the fact that I had to say goodbye before she was gone, and that image, I remember I'd listened to those audios, and it's almost like it was like what he was doing was keening in a way, but keening in his own beautiful, innocent, sort of like connected way. That was maybe a tradition. Like, I mean, I was saying, there's a story in the Aran Islands, the James Sin book, where he comes across a woman grieving her mother, and she jumped into the grave, and she had her grandmother's skull in her arms, and she was keening the death of her mother with her grandmother's skull. So there was like a lineal connection to all mothers in that keening moment. And so I'm just curious about that story, keening his passing of his partner, like the feminine, and his father sounded quite feminine in his ability to express his emotions at a high level. I think John was similar. I guess, from my understanding, that he could articulate that very deeply, but also probably was emotionally. Did you ever see him grieve, or was he grieving, in times of his life?
Well, I suppose there was times in John's life where there was great turmoil. I suppose, did I see him personally grieving? I saw him when he was approaching death himself, and I know he was lonesome about leaving the mountains and leaving the trees and nature behind. And I know that John was in love one time with a woman called Eileen in Connemara, and she was the great love of his life. And when that didn't work out for whatever reason, John was utterly heartbroken. And plus it was a time when he was going through other stuff in his life. He'd had that experience out in the mountain where he felt he wasn't sure of himself. So, it took him a long time to get through that period of his life, because I suppose he was not only grieving the loss of the woman that he loved, he was also grieving the fact that he was resigned to not having, he wasn't going to have a family, and he wasn't going to have that life, So there's a certain grieving in that, but I do know he went through and he would have grieved my grandfather when he died because he was very close to him. But I wouldn't have personally witnessed, but I witnessed John's, John was like the weather, whatever his emotion was, it was, there was kind of no hiding place. Like you go back sometimes and there'd be, there would be a great sense of fun and laughter. He was very humorous and witty.
Yeah.
And then you go back another day and he would be exhausted, tired. And, you'd know that there was no hiding, there was no,
there's no filter.
Pretending I'm okay if I'm not, like, and he'd tell you. And
yeah. And I think as a creative individual, I think it's important. I think in a world that tries to shut down authentic feeling or cauterize it or tailor it into some, something on the phone that people watch, and now the phone is telling you how to grieve or this or that. And I think it's really, authenticity is really the key of the moment right now in the world, is feeling your innermost feelings, not to be man or woman, not, it's almost like a sense of self-betrayal if you're not grieving fully or laughing fully. Like each emotion should have its fullest expression and not be, you stand in a line in a supermarket and you look at the blank faces and those people aren't blank, they're just shut down. Yeah, because they're busy, they're got lots of things going on. But my God, it's a terrible way to stretch your whole life over that path until some big illness or some big death happens, and then it all breaks. Whereas I think you have to spend your life in exultancy, in the highs of the miracle of living, in the lows of the sadness of so much parting and loss in life. But don't just carry it on your back and not share it, not explore it, not express it. I think it makes everyone's life better to not hide who you are.
Yeah, I think, it's something I feel quite strongly about because, like you're saying there about, the internet or the phone tells you how to grieve. Now, I really can't stand that. That does nothing for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might read a good book or you might come across something, but don't send me a meme that says, something kind of meaningless.
Yeah.
I suppose my own experience is, I've experienced of grief, but I don't even know if I've begun to grieve, so it's like I don't know where I am on my grief journey. I lost my son 3.5 years ago. I lost my partner 5 months later, and I ended up, with a therapist to help me through this. And one of the things she said to me was, it's like shaking a bottle of Coke. So you've not just got the grief, you've got the trauma of two sudden, unexpected deaths in a short period of time. And she says it's like opening a bottle of Coke. You've got to open it slowly because maybe sometimes you've got to open. And I do sense that that's it. I'm only able for so much. Plus the fact that, I'm caring for my daughter Anna, who I've mentioned already. I can't afford to go into collapse. You know what I mean? You make a decision. What I find is that you decide to get up in the morning and put one foot, it's one step at a time, it's one day at a time. Maybe in the beginning, it's just one breath at a time. And that's your success in the beginning, that you're able to do that and you're able to be there for other people. But like waiting for your souls to catch up, the Bushman that we just mentioned in the story earlier, it's almost like, grief does catch up with you at times. Like
a wave.
Like we're here tonight doing this interview because Anna is on her first night in respite. And me dropping her off to people, I don't know. I know she's safe and all that, but I found it stirred up unexpected grief in me. There's a grief in that. So, it kind of trips us up, and it's not just grief. I suppose it can be anything. Other people are suffering from things like maybe addiction or, some people have suffered horrendous abuse at the hands of authorities and things like that. Yeah.
And I think kind of come back to the ground level of beauty. And I, one of my things I say is, in the end, all darkness turns into beauty, which some people would say that could be twee, but in my deepest griefs have been my greatest glories after the fact. That
Yeah.
there's a much more of a revelatory appreciation for the moment, which is probably, again, I hate, suddenly, unfortunately, grief is like a lightning bolt to the chest. At the same time, preciousness comes into your view, where when you come to the harder parts of it, which can be extremely lonely, there's this sort of softening of things that you might have taken too seriously, and you suddenly realize that it's like ballast. It starts to drop away, and the balloon of your spirit flies higher the more you realize then what truly matters, what doesn't matter at all. And then you go, does any of it matter at all? And that's not a bad place to be in sometimes. That's a saving grace in a way, where you go, well, we're all walking the same road, it's just at different times, different places. And I had a friend who went last year. His life was gone, and
Okay.
and
Yeah, I'm sorry.
he taught me in the months following about everything that I had turned my face away from, which is like, I started to learn to swim because he was a big surfer. So for some reason, I had never really swum. I started swimming for the first time, and now I love the water. I love being in the pool. I love being embraced by that element. And every time I go in there, I do think of him because he loved the water. He was a surfer, and I go, God, I wish you were here with me, like, because I could show you what I can do now. And in a way, he was my teacher, because although he was very sad at certain times, we were very close. We shared humor and about sadness and about how absurd life can be and how utterly unknown life can be. And so his passing shook me, but shook me into a growing. And
Yeah.
I know John had said, but it always stuck with me, the only thing that really lasts is growth. Everything else, are you still growing? Remember, what's he say about
That's
it?
the, are you still growing is the
Yeah,
real question,
yeah.
and that is it. Is your life still an adventure full of terror, full of glory, full of wonder, full of maybe grief as well? So, and grief is one thing that will
Finds
bring
you.
about growth.
It finds you. It calls you. It comes to you. But then I still, like I said, so do all the other beautiful things. And
Yeah.
what's sad is, in a world that's so obsessed with fear making, and that's not the ordinary person. That's the system and the structure. That beauty is also trying to find us every day.
Yeah, but I wonder, and this is a question rather than a comment,
Yeah.
do does transformation involve, like, by its nature, does there have to be a kind of a darkness in it? Does there have to be a period of turmoil so that we can transform? Will we ever transform if our lives are very comfortable and we have all these theories and we've all these maybe religious or spiritual beliefs or practices, but is there a necessary kind of suffering? And I think that's what John would say brought him back to, the Christian story, not the Christian religion, the Christian story, and the story, of Jesus who crossed the Kedron out of the city life, and then he found himself in Gethsemane, and Gethsemane is where integration happens. And it's a very painful place, and it's a place where it's very hard to stay present to it, and it's very hard not to react from that place. So I suppose it's to sit with that kind of suffering is what he's talking about. And I think maybe, there's a necessary, the path to, I suppose, the path to consciousness inevitably is through the dark night, maybe, or through the Gethsemane experience, maybe, or whatever words you
Well,
like to put on.
go back to Christ. We've talked about this before, about the Christ mythos, and he's taken off the cross and he's in the burial chamber, and then eventually the stone is rolled back, and I believe all pain, all suffering, all darkness and evil has been transfigured into the alchemy of the wounds were necessary for the final cauldron of eternal love.
Yeah.
That he still has the wounds there, but they're being transformed now into unconditional love. And I think the lesson that's left with the people who leave us, and even for me, I had a terrible loss even around my cat when he was killed, was that the loss was the love that could never be.
Yeah.
You know, it's what's you say? Grief is love that hasn't been. What's it? Grief is love. Grief is love. It's still loving, even though the person is gone.
It's just the transformation. There's
Yeah.
both sides of the same coin, and where are our loved ones? Our culture has taught us that death is the end, and maybe that is part of why we grieve. But in other cultures and in our own ancient traditions, the belief was that the dead aren't far away at all. And I think there's evidence of, I suppose, when somebody dies, you become particularly open to that, like it's like the veil is thin, and they're not far away. And the American Indians, John says, believed that death is just a change of form. It's just a change of how we exist, but there's a continuum. It's like when he was dying himself and he was doing an interview on the Joe Duffy show, he said, he was in the departure lounge.
I remember that. Yeah.
And he was going to be, there was a continuum in an elsewhere. And I don't know, there's a beautiful line where he quotes, who was it? And we shall have stars
That's
at elbow and foot.
Yeah. I've often walked it, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
But that idea that even though there is grief, and like you're saying, grief is maybe the other side of love. If we didn't love so much, we wouldn't grieve so much. But there's also the hope that, and not only the hope, the kind of inner knowing that. I remember when John died, I didn't feel this sense of absence. And my father died, I didn't feel the sense of absence. And even with Damien, my son, it's not like I feel an absence, but you still grieve us, like, you know what I mean? So they're never far away, really, I think is what I'm trying to say.
There was what was the saying in one of John O'Donoghue's books that he talked about? I don't know, it was some French writer who'd said that we don't go into death, we spend death, we cross it.
I like this idea of crossing over.
I love the idea of spending death, like it's expended now, it's done. You've gone in and it's out, it's expended. That we're just passing over rather than into. Like the river Styx, that image of that that painting of the rower rowing over the dead to the island of the dead. I used to go and see that painting in the Met a lot. I love those different versions of it. It's a very haunting, but at the same time, not haunting as in spooky, but it's sort of there's a richness in the darkness. I used to be a cave guide and go into 100% darkness, but I'd light that one match, and that one match illuminated everything. That was just a tiny match, like a candle, which I'm very close to intimate with candles. Like the idea of lighting a candle has a permanent reminder of eternity, of there's never full darkness. Even in darkness there's a certain light, there's a certain feeling. And
like I'm thinking, like, if the cave wasn't dark, if that cave wasn't dark, the light would be insignificant. So there's a necessary darkness. And even for a seed or a birth to take place, you think of the womb and you think the darkness of the seed. And, maybe in the springtime, a shaft of light penetrates and causes the seed to crack open, and then you have the emergence of something new again. So I think, there's a necessary kind of womb darkness or seed darkness that is part of, like, there's no light without dark.
And I think we too much besmirch the dark. I mean, I love the winter, to be honest with you. I love coming out of the winter. And the winter light is my favourite light for filming, and I do a lot of filming, and I get the most beautiful shapes because the light is penetrating through even the veil of darkness, and therefore it's more, it brings a holiness to everything that it touches on. Whereas in the summer, it's great to be in the summer, it feels warm, but the light is almost bleached. Whereas in the darkness of winter, and you get that sunrise, that late sunrise, and the whole land just turns golden with a bit of frost, and you go, the light speaks to you even more. And I think
Yeah.
our passings, the people who are inevitably passed through, like all of us, their memory are like pieces of light in the winter darkness. That it feels more
Yeah.
pronounced to remember them in the darkness, when it's dark, when it feels grieving. The light, it feels almost, it's incredibly sad, but there's something kind of poignant and connected about it as well, you know?
Yeah, it's good to it's good to remember, I suppose. That's why we have the November, the month of the dead in Ireland.
Yeah.
And, it gives us a space where we can remember and where we can approach that. And I was just thinking as you were speaking there about, we see light and dark, and we see grief and love, and these things we're talking about as opposites, but maybe they're necessary for each other. And I don't know if you're familiar with that lovely passage. God, it's one of my favorites, where he talks about being at home in North Kerry, and where when John was young, they had the paraffin lamp and they had the open fire. They had no electricity or anything like that. So he spoke about the light of the lamp, which would be a flickering flame, and the light of the fire, which would be rising and falling. And he talked about it as being a gypsy dance, between light and dark. And there was no enmity between the light and dark. They existed and they coexisted. And I think that's what we forget. We want light, we want positivity, we want all of this, but it doesn't exist without its opposite, really. Like Blake said, the poet and the mystic, there's a kind of a marriage of opposites that's necessary.
And I think relationally in the world, instead of creating enemies between people and neighbors and friends and this race and that creed and that country and this religion, is if we could see that we're all bound obviously by mortality, but we're also bound by the fact that we all suffer. I heard it's one of Sting's songs where he said, "There's no victory without love." That's a great
Yeah.
line. I love that line. It's so simple in the world right now. There's no victory in anything without love. There's no, a material victory is hollow. A war is meaningless and fruitless, is in that without love involved, or loving other. If we could recognize that, there'd be a lot less war. That we're all bound by
Yeah.
the same mortal. And we're constantly divided every day, but we don't do the dividing. Yet we can be rebound ourselves. Grief, what we're talking about here, is one of the greatest collective forces on earth. I think the more the world is in grief right now, the closer it's bringing us into connectivity, has a global consciousness that we're all recognizing. Why do we all, like the Gaza war, all this, we all grieved together, and we were being brought closer. Religion, all of that was becoming formless, but grief was our identity. We were identifying with a grief together. And I think grief is very
Yeah.
important. You couldn't do that in light. It had to be the dark that brought us in. So it's a very valuable, unfortunately, it's necessary, but it's a very valuable thing to experience collectively, is grief.
And I don't know how you feel about this, Alan, but I don't know if you've seen the Buddhist monks that are walking,
Yeah, no, I totally. My friend met
for
them actually
peace.
in North Carolina. She met them, and I'd had this idea of everyone walking to the Middle East. I know it sounded crazy, but that's sort of what they're doing. They don't have a placard. They don't have a specific slant. It's just human beings, and what our people are doing is they're attaching their hope to this blank canvas of goodness.
And, coming out of a country like America, and you can see the support they're getting.
Oh,
People
huge!
really, people are hungry for this, and it's so
Absolutely,
simple.
yeah,
So it's like you cracking a match in the Alloy or in the caves in
yeah,
the Burn,
yeah.
It's like they're cracked a match, and there's something happening that's very beautiful. And John said in his interview with Tommy Tiernan, there's a beautiful video on YouTube that you can access where, and he says we need to do something radical, like walk backwards
Yeah,
across
that's right. Yeah,
China, and
yeah.
it's almost like these monks are walking, in their orange robes and just collecting flowers and
And you know what they're
saying
doing?
very little.
They're breaking time.
Yeah,
Time controlled by the sort of the structure regulates away from magic. and breaking time like a gesture of love, or one time I was up in Healy Pass, which is this place between Kenmare and West Cork, and it was this bleak sort of windy road where it was part of a famine history there, but it was late winter, but yet up the top of this valley, it was a beautiful place, but it was very bleak. But I like all these bleak, beautiful places. There was one tiny dandelion, just one dandelion left, but it was so yellow against the grey, and that's what those monks are. It only takes one colour. It's like in the film Schindler's List and the girl in the red dress, to define the red dress. We have our red dress moment in life, in culture, if we look for it. It can be when that guy wrote the poem about Patrick O'Leary, when I was at his funeral, and the priest, who didn't really know him very well, was kind of droning on about his life, and he was a bit of a wild man. He used to defrost his beers on the school bus passing by his door in the morning.
Okay.
But whilst he was talking, a bird was singing in the rafters, and that was his eulogy. That was his eulogy, because he was so close to nature. So that's breaking time, isn't it? And that breaking time, like the way we looked at the tragedies last year because of what was going on in the Middle East, that's still going on. But grief breaks time. Therefore, grief has some portent of magic. So does acts of goodness too, as well, of course, And we can never forget that if we did nothing, if I was bringing up a child, I'd say to them, if you did nothing but were kind your whole life, then you succeeded. Doesn't matter whether you're a doctor, you're a billionaire, you're a road sweeper, you're a flute player, you're a stamp collector, you iron clothes. If you're kind, then you're achieving. That's not taught. Amen. That's not taught in the structure of university. Be kind first. Be kind.
Well, I think John talks about passion and compassion, and I have one of my pet, how will I say? I will say hates, but one thing I really don't like is idealism. We can go through phases where we're very idealistic, and I look at young people now, and let's say I have a daughter who's 25, and she's just getting going in the world in terms of, trying to get her life together and her career together and look at the possibility of a future. But it's so hard for them, because it's so, they need to get on the property ladder, and they need to travel, and they need to finish their education and get, their lives are very different, from what we talk about. So I suppose it's not just about having compassion for those who are downtrodden, and like he says it somewhere that we need to be compassionate with the sage and the downtrodden, but we also need to be compassionate with the person living in Manhattan and who's dealing in the stock exchange, because their lives are also maybe have their own hardships. So it's well, how did I get around to that, Alan?
Well, you're talking about the fact that you were talking about grief. We're all everybody's carrying a cross.
Yeah.
Everybody, and I've met
everyone is carrying something, and there's more pressure on people now. It's harder for people to wait for their souls to catch up, if you like.
Yeah. But questions of people maybe who know of his work but don't. When you think of the outsider, when you think of as he was called, the bishop of the margins, when you think of the wanderer, the exile, or the intentional exile, when you think of the bushman, the yogi, the shaman, the writer, the poet, the person singing songs into the landscape, when you think of those who are outside of the realm of the, in parentheses, everyday, when I first thought of him, and I hadn't gone out as much as I have now, but you think, the irony is, you think, oh, was he lonely out there in the bog of his mind? Was he lonely in the trepidations of his discoveries? Was he lonely, feeling all those miracles and wanting to share them? But the image in society is of the outsider, is of someone who's a figure of loneliness, or and would he have expressed at certain times, a kind of loneliness?
I suppose he wasn't lonely, I would have to say, because he was very social, very expressive, and he met people at their level. But I do think, and this question has been asked before, there is a loneliness in not being understood.
Oh, yeah.
So if you go to a depth where, the people you're meeting haven't gone, or in John's case, if you're writing stuff that very few people understand, there's a loneliness in trying to express from that place because, there's nobody, there's very few people able to go there and communicate with you at that level. And I think there is a loneliness in that. And I think, maybe John did experience something of that. I do. Like, I know I did not understand John. I understood John as an uncle, and I understood him because I'm a Moriarty. I understood the background. I understand my grandfather, my mother. I understood, the madness of the Moriarty's, if you like. And I don't mean insanity, but I mean like they were kind of a wild crowd. So I had that kind of understanding. But it was only when John died that I really started reading his books. And the irony of it is I read John's books out of embarrassment because I would meet people who would recognize me as the little Amanda from the stories, and I would know nothing about the work. So it was embarrassment. But what I'm saying is that I think there was a loneliness in it. Maybe was there 2 or 3 people that understood it, and he was putting these books out into the world, and he knew they weren't going to sell. Like he even said, like they were, Nostos might be used as a doorstop, and for some people that was the case. Because they get so far into the reading, and then they become a bit stuck. And times have changed. This is the interesting thing with John, that it's like there's a readiness now to hear John.
Yeah, the more hungry we become, the more disembodied we become from the modernity of the world, the more we need to go back and get the root, go back to back home to the base, and go back home to the nourishment of. And you could take lines from his books, because they can be quite dense, but you can take a line from that book and think about it all day, one line.
You can take a story. I mean, the best thing is the stories, and like there is as much revelation in a story as there is in some of John's books. Like, so it's like the entirety is contained in the little morsels, in the macrocosm is in the microcosm in John's work as well, because, I share some of this stuff on the Facebook community that I dedicate to sharing bits of John's work, and there's so much wisdom in a few lines. You don't need the 700 pages. Like, just take a passage and digest that for a day, and you're on your way.
And we'll wrap up soon, but there's a couple of things, as I said before. We already have a certain, as he said, a genius in us, and what he's giving us through his doorway is to access that. You can follow him into the church of his knowledge in a way, and get access to your own knowledge in a way, or beginnings of your own journey, your own teachings. And I think it's really important to say that he wouldn't have liked the idea of him being idolized or overly worshipped. I think what he wanted...
Oh, absolutely not. He wouldn't. Like, I mean, I see it from time to time. People idolize John Moriarty. He was amazing. There's no doubt about that. And how fortunate anyone who met him was, or even to have access to these, audio recordings and things like that. It's a great privilege. But John Moriarty, I suppose he retreated from that. He did not want that. It's about, he has passed on this legacy to us. And he's not even saying that he knows something and we don't know. He's saying, here is what I have to offer from my experience. Now over to you. And I think he says that like Black Elk had a vision, Black Elk, the Lakota, was he Lakota? Anyway, the Native American elder, Black Elk, had a vision when he was a child. And he kept that vision his whole life. And he was a holy man, and in his tribe, and he then communicated that vision, and it was written down. And when he had it written, he was an older man at this stage, and he said, "Now it's yours. Now it's yours to take it forward and to let it grow from there." And I think John Moriarty did exactly the same thing. Like he buried the plans for his hedge school, which was called Shlina Fiorna. He buried that in the ground, in the earth. And it was like, he planted it in the earth. And it was for the earth to decide what happened after that. So that's what John did. He has planted all of this stuff. And it's amazing. It's not because he's my uncle, but I don't think I've ever read anything that has taken me as deep as John Moriarty has in some ways. And I've read Carl Jung, and I've read, I've read lots of stuff like that. And, it is healing, and it is nourishing. And I think the time is right for it right now.
And I think, I'm sure he would agree if he's alive, or maybe he wouldn't. But when it comes down to all of his work and all the work of the greats, is that yet still he would put all that aside, the books and the philosophy, to stand and watch the robin looking at the worm, or you know what I mean? Like when it came down to it, is that's there for everybody, and he, it's extraordinary that he had to go through such a huge arc, or his depth of expression around all of the different facilities of our existence, both religious and mythical and psychological and biological, and to do with Ireland. And yet he understood what I loved about his, like, for example, I want to play a clip of the end of my favourite story, which is the story of Big Mike.
Yeah.
Which is a man coming back to the Aran Islands after 40 years looking for all the big answers to the big questions. It's his most sonorous story to me. And the clip I'll play is at the very end when he finally comes back from going out in his boat all night, and the islanders wonders what is he doing, and he talks about the revelation of fishing without nets, fishing without emptying out everything out of yourself. It comes down to what's at the bottom of that. It's all a miracle. It's all divine ground.
Yeah.
So just sorry, go ahead.
I'm wondering, would it be a good time to I have a passage here that is an interesting story besides. It's a very short passage from
Of course.
And it's funny how I found it, because a friend of John's, Father Pat Moore, after John had died, asked me could I find a passage, because they were doing something in the church for Writers' Week, and I didn't know the work, like I said, very well at that stage. And I went out to the backyard where I was living with a cup of tea in my hand, and I said, I'm going to sit down and find something in Nostos. And the wind blew the page open, and it opened at a most beautiful passage. And maybe it'll only take a minute.
Go ahead. Lovely. Yeah, absolutely. Please do. Please read it.
So it's called The Hill Meadow. And it's from Nostos, John's autobiography. And the Hill Meadow was one of the fields where John grew up. In the Hill Meadow, I saw hints of paradise. It was the only name I had for the flowers that grew there. Primroses and cowslips and the dry part of it, and in the more marshy parts, buttercups and orchids. And I wonder, how could something so yellow as a buttercup come up out of brown soil? How could something so purple as an orchid come up out of it? How could something so perfect as a cowslip come up out of it? Where did the colour and the perfection come from? And what else was down there? What else was I walking on? To me, to inhale the fragrance of a primrose was a Eucharist without suggestion of bloodshed or blood. Sometimes I'd inhale the fragrance down to the very soles of my feet. Then I could walk the earth without hurting it. Then I could walk in paradise. Right here in our own hill meadow, I could walk in paradise.
Wow. It's extraordinary. He paints a symphony from a single moment.
Yeah.
From that comes, that's what I love about his writing. It's like the micro becomes the entire universe of life.
Yeah.
That really is him in his essence, I know we could keep going, but I guess for the listener, the reader, I'll play that clip at the end, which is the clip from Big Mike. You know the story. You know the part at the end. And I just
Yeah, I
wanted
do.
to,
It'll be that was a lovely way to finish, Alan.
and I just want to thank you, and I just want to ask you to ask people who are now might be ignited to take further interest. What is available for them to examine more of his extraordinary breadth of work? You have a Facebook page. You want to tell people about that and other things?
Yeah, well, there's the books that are available from both
course.
Amazon and Lilliput Press. So if you just Google John Moriarty, you'll get the collection of books. So they're available. And then there's books that other people have written, kind of edited books like Martin Shaw, Mary McGillicuddy, and you have Brendan O'Donoghue and Michael Higgins. So there's 4 books there. Actually, there's 5. I've written one myself about those early stories with Mary McGillicuddy from Leitrim Hill. That's called Grounded in Story. So they're all available from mostly Lilliput Press in Dublin.
Yeah.
There's the audio collections that we have.
Yeah, I love
there's
that
2
so
audio
much.
collections.
Yeah.
They're amazing. So there's One Evening in Eden from Lilliput again, and there's another one about the Celtic mythologies, and that's from a company called Hearing God's Word. Again, you'll have to Google it, but they're available to download, which is they're wonderful. Like you have 4 hours of those audios for, I think it's €10 or something. I run the Facebook community, so I put a small little snippet, either a story or a passage, out there every morning, and it gains a terrific response, and there's a beautiful community. And I've met some wonderful people, including yourself, through that Facebook page.
That's right. And then his stuff is on YouTube as well.
It is, yeah. You can get a lot of it for free.
Some of the stories, and then of course there's the festival. What's the one?
Yes.
It's coming up in Belfast. Just to give that a quick plug.
Imagine Ireland are hosting an event called Invoking Ireland on the 28th of March in Belfast. I'm really looking forward to that. So, we're talking about getting in touch with the folkloric part of our psyches, and that's, I suppose, the aim is to go to Belfast and bring stories and song and music and poetry, and learn what we can up there, you know what I mean, participate up there. So that should be a very good festival. Tommy Tiernan, Liam Wainley, Diarmid Ling, I'll be there. Steve Court will be there, of course.
Yeah, she was in her last. She was great. She was a singer. If anyone hasn't heard her and I speak, that's in the other podcast episode. If you subscribe to the channel that you're listening to this on, I'll be doing these regularly. So she's part of that. So it's a very, Ireland's become, there's so many emerging treasures and speakers and people who are singing the song of the land. And the revival isn't accidental, it's synchronistic.
It's wonderful what's happening in Ireland.
It always, Ireland keeps resurrecting. It's the cow that gives endless milk. Ireland keeps resurrecting regardless of how the globe is. That's why so many people are beloved from afar with this place, and so many people are full of longing for this place. It is a place a lot of people haven't been to, but yet they feel like they've been there already.
Yeah,
and
as he says, the dragon energies are still alive in the land. You know what I mean? And we can access that maybe from time to time.
But listen, Amanda, it was lovely to talk to you. We had a lovely chat here in the late night hours of the beckoning spring. I still believe spring is going to come. And like I said, we'll end on a piece with Big Mike. And if anyone wants to connect in with John's community, go to the John Moriarty community page on Facebook, which Amanda hosts, and he will keep growing, I think, and he will keep his word will keep spreading, whatever way the world turns. He's a bit of a bedrock, becoming more and more here. And I always said once I'd love to get all his audios. I've given those audios to a lot of people who I visited. So some of that stuff, that was before he started really growing the way he is now. So for anyone out there, please get hold of some of what he has to say, because it's deep medicine, and you're never not a better person when you've listened to his work or read his work.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, for hosting this, and thank you for having me. Yeah, great conversation.
Well, thanks
Really
everybody,
appreciate.
and thank you, Amanda, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of Ireland Speaks. So bless you all and safe journeys in your travels.
And they all came into the slip, and the women were waiting for them. And they counted the boats coming round the headland, and yes, there was 10, 12, there was 15, 16, 18, 19, Jesus, even Big Mike, they're all coming home. And when they came home, when they moored their boats that morning by the pier, Ned Lavelle went over specially to look into Big Mike's boat, and he looked down and saw there wasn't even a scale of fish in it. And he went home, and he was lying in his bed, and he was thinking, and it was getting the worst of him, because he was thinking, Christ, what's going on here? Big Mike, when I called out last night, asked him, how was the fishing? He said the fishing was good, the fishing was very good, the fishing was fantastic. And yet when I looked in his boat this morning, there wasn't even a scale of fish in it. So again today he couldn't sleep. So again he had to get up out of bed and go up, and he walked into Big Mike and said, Big Mike, I've come up to talk to you, and I'm in trouble. I've come up to talk to you because I don't understand you. We don't understand you. None of us any longer understand you. And I'll tell you the story. You know the dark that came down in the world there the other night. We were out there in that dark. And I was aware of something happening, and I called out to you. I called out, is that you, Big Mike? And it was your voice that came back to me out of that dark saying, it is me. And then I asked you, fishing. I said, how's the fishing? And the answer that came back, and we all recognised it to be you, your voice coming back to us out of that dark. The fishing is good. The fishing is very good. The fishing is fantastic. Now, when I looked in your boat the next morning, when we finally came home and I looked in your boat, there wasn't even a scale of fish in your boat. What in Christ's name do you mean? And Big Mike was sitting by the fire, and he seemed relaxed. He seemed to be delighted and happy that the question was finally asked of him. And he says, I'll tell you, and I'll be happy to tell you what I'm up to. I left here, as you know, as a young lad of 14, and I went off into the world. And I went on board and started to work on some old tramp steamers that plied between Glasgow and Liverpool and placed up and down the English coast and up and down the English Channel. That's where I was. But finally I took to the great ocean and I went out in the great boats. And there were times out there when big questions out there in the roaring 40s of my own psyche, and out there beyond the capes, all the great capes and the big latitudes and longitudes of the world, great questions arose in my mind. I needed answers. So I didn't spend all my time in these big merchant marine ships. There were times when I went inland. I climbed the Himalayas to certain monasteries in Tibet. I went to ashrams in India. I went to all these places looking for questions, looking for answers. I had questions and I was looking for answers. And I've met a lot of the holy women and a lot of the holy men of the world. And I've learned about the religions of the world. I've learned about Hinduism and Buddhism. I've learned about these religions because I was seeking answers. But somehow or other I didn't find, somehow or other I wasn't finding the answer I was looking for. And one day, it was in the outback in Australia, I was talking to an old medicine man there. I jumped ship and went inland to meet an old medicine man, to meet whomever I might meet. But I met an old medicine man, and he said to me, you're never going to find it here in this outback. Go back to your own outback. Go back to your own ocean. Go back to your own island in the ocean. If you're ever to find it, you'll find it there. I came back, and you know that I came back. And you know also Ned Lavelle, you know your own holy book, because you've heard it read to you in the Mass. You know that there have been some people that God seemed to have chosen because God wanted to enact a parable upon them. He enacted a parable on Jonah. He enacted a parable upon Jonah. He enacted a parable, a new revelation of some kind. He enacted a parable that had in it a new revelation upon Job. And sometimes in my course of my life, I thought, Jesus, maybe God is trying to enact a parable through me. And maybe he did. And maybe that's what's been going on. Maybe God chose me. I didn't feel chosen, but maybe at some depth of me, I don't know what's going on. But maybe in some sense, God has been enacting a parable on me. And you know the parable, and I'll tell you the parable. All my life long, throughout all of my life, I've been searching for the answer, and I've gone down into the great ocean of experience, gone down into the great oceans of waking awareness, and gone down into the great oceans of dreaming awareness. And night after night, I've cast the net of my mind into the ocean of experience, waking and dreaming, the net of my mind into that over the right gunnel, into the great ocean of experience. I've cast the net of my heart over the left gunnel into the great ocean of experience. And in the morning, when I'd be hauling the net of my mind, I always hoped I always hoped that I would find the great answer, the great formula, the great creed, the great saving Upanishad or whatever it is, that I would find it there, having fished all night with the net of my mind in the great ocean of experience, that I would find the great answer there. I hoped that when I draw the net of my heart, that I would find the great passion, the great saving passion, the great saving compassion and passion, the great saving intuition, whatever it is that can be in the heart, that floats into the heart, that I would find it there. But you know, and I know, that I never, no matter how long I continue that never will I find the answer in the net of my mind. Never will I find the answer in the net of my heart. And you know then what I did? I hauled the net of my mind and I hauled the net of my heart and I put them in a bag and I hung them up outside my outhouse, and then I went down. And I went out beyond the foamings and out beyond the headland, out into the great deep, out into the great dark that you experienced on one night. It was out into that dark I would go every night. And I went out into the dark with no nets at all. The net of my mind left behind in my outhouse, the net of my heart left behind. And I have news for you, Big Mike. I have news for you, Ned Lavelle. I have great news for you. When you go down into the great ocean, when you go down into the great void, and you have no nets to fish with, that's when the fishing is good, when the fishing is very good, when the fishing is fantastic. You've left the net of your mind behind, you've left the net of your heart behind, and now you're not fishing at all. And now not fishing at all, that's when the fishing is good, when the fishing is very good, when the fishing is fantastic. And that's good news for Christians, and that's good news for Buddhists, and that's good news for dinosaurs, and that's good news for the great bear in the sky. And we've all heard, I talked earlier this evening about this journey into the dark, this journey into the tenebrae. And you know the great ritual that is performed in the Christian church when the 15 candles would be lighted and they would enact the darkness of Good Friday. And every now and again, as they chanted the great tragic psalms, a candle would be quenched, and finally the last candle would be the last lighted candle would be taken round and buried in the cave or the tomb behind the altar, and the church would be in darkness. And they were now enacting the Good Friday darkness. And out of that tremendous first Good Friday darkness, a terrible voice called out, an incredible screech came out of that darkness saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And when people heard that cry, that divine cry, my God, lama, lama, sabachthani, coming out, people melted away. They weren't able for it. But maybe there were some people, maybe, if instead of melting away when they had that terrible cry of dereliction, terrible cry of God-forsakenness, if they had stayed around for yet another while, for yet another day or yet another half an hour, if they had stayed around, or because in a way time doesn't matter here, but if they had decided to stay, maybe out of that great darkness, that great tenebrae, they would have heard a voice calling out, the same voice, but in another mood now, saying, the fishing is good, the fishing is very good, the fishing is fantastic. And that's good news for Christians, it's good news for Hindus, it's good news for Buddhists, it's good news for dinosaurs, it's good news for the constellations beyond our universe, beyond our solar system, and beyond our galaxy. That is good news. There is Christian good news. And the day we hang up the net of our mind and hang up the net of our heart, that's the day that we experience the bliss of self-loss in divine ground. The Christian invitation to the journey is an immense invitation. We must, in a sense, set no limits to it. We must, in a sense, set no limits to the following of Christ. But I think at the end of the journey, there is blissful good news. The great cry of dereliction, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, isn't the last words. The last words might be something like, the fishing is good. The fishing, not fishing at all. The net of my mind hung up, and the net of my heart hung up, and the net of sexuality in me hung up, all nets with which I could fish with hang up. The fishing, not fishing at all, is bliss. The fishing, not fishing at all, is fantastic. So there maybe is Christian good news. God bless you. That's it.